Somewhere on the edge of Gray Mesa, a man they called the Shade staggered through a white hell, clutching the medicine that might save the only child who still believed he was worth saving. They said Calder Vance was a ghost, that guilt kept him buried in the pines. But that night, when the wind howled like a dying promise, Rowan Ashford found him half buried in the snow, blue lips, blood at his brow, and for the first time, the ghost chose to come home. "Don't let her go," he rasped, voice cracked like the ice around him. And Rowan whispered back through tears and storm, "Then stay, and save her yourself." This is how a storm brought a haunted man back to the fire, and how a girl named Wren proved that even the lost can be found. Rowan Ashford had once walked through marble foyers in Boston, her heels clicking like a promise on polished floors, her hair pinned in a way that made mothers whisper, "What a fine match she'll make." Chirioi. They called her the Ashford girl, the one with the soft voice, the graceful laugh, the polite nods in drawing rooms too cold to breathe in. But that was before Daniel Whitcomb, the fiancé her family had paraded like a prize. He'd been charming in public, all gallant bows and white gloves, but behind closed doors he carried a blade sharper than gossip. When he turned on her, humiliating her at their engagement party, whispering falsehoods into eager ears, the scandal tore through Boston society pages like fire through silk. The Herald called her the runaway bride of Ashford House. Guess who once kissed her gloved hand now crossed the street when they saw her? That's how she learned the cruelest thing about shame. It's not the truth that buries you. It's the lies people prefer to believe. When the last store in Boston closed, she sold her mother's pearls to buy a one-way fare west, clutching a letter of hire from a man she'd never met at a place that didn't even show up on most maps. Gray Mesa Ranch. Her name didn't buy her anything out here, and for the first time she found that comforting. The stagecoach groaned under the weight of crates and the cold as it lurched north along the ridge road. Pines pressed close to the rutted track, their dark needles rattling in the wind like the bones of a lost choir. The driver, a thick-shouldered man in a matted coat, kept glancing at her from beneath his fur-lined hat. "You got any kin waiting for you up there?" he asked, voice muffled by the wool scarf wrapped around his neck. Rowan clutched her worn leather satchel tighter on her lap. "No kin, just the girl I'm to teach." The driver snorted, eyes fixed ahead on the snaking road that vanished into the fog of falling snow. "Gray Mesa's no place for city folk. Some say you hear wailing on the ridge if you ride past midnight. Some say you see him." Rowan turned her head to the window, but the glass offered no comfort, only the reflection of a woman who barely recognized herself. "Who?" she asked, though she already half knew the name from the whispers in Sable Creek. "The Shade of the Pines," the driver muttered. "Calder Vance. Was a man once. Now he's not much more than wind and regret." Rowan's lips pressed into a thin line. The wind howled, shoving the stagecoach sideways. The horse's hooves struck sparks off half-frozen stones. She thought of how gossip had carved her down to a ghost, too. Not dead, but not quite living either. She closed her eyes and let the rattle of wheels blur her thoughts into one steady truth. You don't outrun a shadow, you wear it. Out here, she told herself, the land was bigger than her shame. It could swallow it whole, scatter it across the pines and the gray stone mesas until nothing remained but the woman who would stand firm when the next storm came. The driver cleared his throat. "They say the shade wanders because guilt keeps him chained, like he's waiting for someone to forgive him." Rowan opened her eyes and met his in the cracked mirror above the driver's shoulder. "Then maybe he's not the only ghost out here," she said softly. She watched the road ahead, the endless spires of pine closing in like silent witnesses. In Boston, people fed on your secrets like crows. But in Gray Mesa, secrets roamed the hills on horseback, waiting for someone brave enough to follow them home. And somewhere in the blizzard ahead, she felt the first spark of something that might one day be forgiveness. Not for Calder Vance, for herself. When the stagecoach finally rattled away down the ridge road, Rowan Ashford stood alone at the split-rail fence of Gray Mesa Ranch. The wind sliced through the folds of her coat, threading cold fingers beneath her collar as she stared at the crooked sign swaying above the gate. The paint so faded, you'd think the land itself had given up on the name. A rickety corral stretched out before her, its fence rails groaning as if they carried secrets. Beyond it, the barn loomed, a squat, weather-beaten thing that seemed to watch her back with every step. Somewhere inside, horses stamped their hooves, the sharp scent of hay and damp iron drifting out in ghostly breaths of steam. Rowan stepped forward, boots crunching through old straw and patches of ice. It smelled of animals and sweat and something older. The tang of rusted nails driven into beams that should have been replaced a lifetime ago. Her breath formed pale clouds in the half-light. The barn door scraped open, and there he was, Harlan Boone. He was broad across the shoulders, thick hands scarred from rope and frostbite, a tobacco stain riding the corner of his mouth. He watched her like a coyote sizing up something too soft for these parts. "So," he grunted, wiping grease from his fingers onto his tattered coat. "You're the new governess." "Rowan Ashford," she said, lifting her chin. She offered her hand, but Boone only stared at it, as though the gesture insulted him more than her presence ever could. "Calder got himself a real charity case, didn't he?" Boone spat the words out like they tasted bad. "Or maybe it's you who thinks you're doing charity for the girl." Rowan stiffened. "I'm here because Wren deserves better than being left to rot out here alone." He barked a humorless laugh that echoed inside the barn's beams. "You think you know what that girl deserves? Calder Vance is off in the trees, playing ghost, while real men do the work that keeps her fed. Don't expect him to come down just 'cause you showed up with a bag full of books." He stepped closer, breath smelling of stale coffee and winter whiskey. "You want to last here, Miss Ashford? Don't go looking for ghosts in these hills. He ain't no savior." She held his gaze, feeling the fence boards shiver behind her. "Maybe he doesn't have to be," she said quietly. Boone grunted and stalked off, muttering under his breath about fools who believe in shadows. That night, the ranch pressed its silence around her like a second skin. Rowan lay curled on the thin mattress in a room no bigger than a horse stall, the wind rattling the warped shutters. Sleep came in fits and starts, until it didn't. Somewhere in the dark, she dreamed she stood knee-deep in snow. Pines loomed overhead, and between them, a lone figure waited. Coat tattered, head bowed. He lifted his face, and though she couldn't see his eyes, she knew he was looking straight through her. A voice, rough and hollow, whispered her name across the drifts. "Rowan!" She woke with her heart hammering, the image of the ghost still clinging to her like frost. Rowan Ashford found Wren perched at the far end of the parlor that first morning, knees drawn up under her chin, face half hidden behind a curtain of tangled brown hair. The child didn't speak when Rowan came in with her battered satchel of readers and chalk. She only traced a finger across the frost-laced windowpane, sketching the faint outline of a bird, its wings forever mid-flight, frozen in the breath of winter. Rowan set the satchel down, careful not to startle her. "You like birds?" she asked softly. Wren's eyes flicked to her, then back to the glass. The little girl shrugged, a movement so small it could have been a shiver. Rowan pulled up a chair and watched the child's fingertip dart like a tiny brush. The window was soon dotted with fragile sparrows and wrens. Flocks etched into the dust that gathered where the wind slipped through. In Boston's drawing rooms, children were taught to hold their tongues and smile prettily on cue. But here in the high hush of Gray Mesa, a child's silence felt different, like it grew roots deep in the hard ground, stubborn and wary. Rowan hummed an old tune her mother once sang in the kitchen, a song of warm kitchens, of bread rising in the oven, while snow drummed on the sills. She didn't know if Wren was listening, but when Rowan rose to fetch the primer, she found a new shape on the window, two birds side by side. That night, Rowan sat near the hearth, turning a page in her journal while Wren dozed against her shoulder. She remembered a story her grandmother used to tell. Not polished society gossip, but a true tale from the early days on the frontier. A widow named Ruth Cartwright, left alone after a cattle raid, took in two children she found half-starved beside a burned-out wagon. No one paid her, no one praised her. She just did what the land taught her. You feed what's hungry, you stand watch when no one else will. Those two children grew to be riders, ranchers, fathers and mothers in their own right, all because one woman refused to let the prairie's cruelty decide who deserved to live. Rowan ran her fingers gently through Wren's hair, finer than thistledown. This land could chew you up, spit you out, and never blink an eye. People weren't much different, she thought. But one small kindness, a loaf of bread left at a door, a blanket laid over narrow shoulders, a lullaby hummed into the shadows, could be the difference between a child who curled in on herself like a withered root and one who found the courage to look you in the eye. When the wind rattled the shutters that night, Rowan thought of the figures Wren drew on the glass. Tiny birds, wings outstretched, always leaving but never quite gone. She wondered if Calder Vance, the shade who haunted these hills, even knew that somewhere in this drafty house, a child still waited for him, like those birds waited for spring. Rowan whispered into Wren's hair, a promise as fragile as frost. "I'll stand watch. You just keep flying." The first time Rowan saw him, it was nothing more than a shape against the ridge at dawn, a tall, lone figure on horseback, half swallowed by a drifting veil of mist. She had stepped out to draw water from the pump behind the bunkhouse when the dark silhouette caught her eye. He didn't move, didn't wave, just sat astride the animal as if carved out of the dawn itself. By the time she blinked, the shape dissolved into the trees. The second time came a week later. Rowan had taken Wren down the slope to gather wild onion shoots near the creek bed. The girl's laughter, a brittle thing, but real, carried through the brittle hush of early spring. When Rowan glanced up, she spotted him again, a man standing just beyond the fence line, coat flapping in the breeze, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A sliver of light caught the edge of his cheek, the faint white line of an old scar. A wolfhound padded at his side, lean as a shadow, eyes glinting like river stone. When she told the ranch hands about it that night, they only nodded knowingly. It turned out they'd seen him too, or thought they had. Old Seth, the wrangler with a cough that never quit, claimed he once woke before dawn and found fresh feed laid out by the east gate, neat as if the wind had done it. Another swore he'd tracked prints through the snow that looped in lazy circles around the cattle pens, broad hoof prints that vanished into the timberline without a sound. "They say the shade of the pines walks with a wild wolf at his heel," Seth rasped by the fire, his boots propped up on a crate. "Keeps the coyotes off, keeps the cattle calm." "Or spooks them to death," Harlan Boone snorted, throwing a log onto the flames. He glared at Rowan over the rising sparks. "You'd do well not to encourage ghost stories, Miss Ashford. Some men ain't worth dragging back into the light." Rowan said nothing, but that night she packed a small bundle in the dark, a heel of bread, still warm from the hearth, a folded scrap of paper with a single line. "Thank you for watching over her." She left it on the fence post by the north paddock, where she'd seen the shape that morning. By dawn, the bundle was gone, not torn apart by raccoons or wind, but lifted clean away. In its place, tucked between two rough boards, lay a single crow feather and a sprig of blue lupine so fresh it still wept dew. In the weeks that followed, it became a ritual Rowan kept secret even from Wren: an apple wrapped in cloth, a biscuit, sometimes a pencil nub or a page torn from a tattered book. Each time the offering vanished under the moon's quiet watch, replaced by something small but precise: a carving of a tiny horse, a smoothed river stone, a blossom pinned with a thorn. Standing at the fence one dawn, Rowan pressed her palm to the cold wood, the feather clutched in her other hand. Some men spoke their apologies in confessions and tears. Calder Vance, the shade, spoke his in the soft weight of gifts left for a child who never stopped waiting, and for the woman who refused to let a ghost remain just a ghost. By the time the blizzard came down from Gray Mesa, the world shrank to white and the sound of the wind clawing at the barn eaves. Rowan stood at the window, squinting through the swirl. Somewhere out there, Calder Vance, the shade, was riding the ridge, a lone figure swallowed by the storm. They'd run out of medicine 3 days ago. Wren's breath rattled in her chest, fever blooming like wildfire under blankets that couldn't hold the chill at bay. Boone was gone, drunk and huddled in Sable Creek, no doubt, leaving Rowan to tend the fire, to keep the child awake when the wind begged them both to sleep. She wrapped her shawl tighter, trying not to imagine Calder out there, lashes caked with frost, the saddle leather cracking under him as he pushed the mare forward. Why do I trust this man who only appears when the snow falls? She asked herself, forehead pressed to the frozen pain. Why do I believe in a ghost when what I need is flesh and blood and warmth? But in the hush between her thoughts, an old story surfaced, one her grandmother whispered when the world was still safe. A tale of a drifter named McKinney who'd stumbled onto a dying family stranded by an early freeze. The mother pleaded with him to save her boy. So McKinney, a man who owed no one anything, rode 3 days through sleet and dark to fetch the only doctor in that part of Wyoming. He made it back just as the last lantern in their cabin guttered out. That boy grew up to own the biggest cattle line in the valley, but every year he left a red kerchief tied to McKinney's old fence post. A promise paid forward, that you don't have to save the world, just one soul at a time. The wind screamed around the corners of the house. When Rowan heard the frantic hoofbeats, she bolted outside, skirts whipping her legs raw. Calder's shape emerged like a nightmare-given form. A man hunched low in the saddle, arms wrapped tight around a satchel. He slumped off the mare before she could speak, landing half buried in the snowdrift. She knelt beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Calder! Calder! Stay with me!" His eyes cracked open, dark with snow melt and secrets. "Take it," he rasped, pressing the satchel into her arms, for Wren didn't come this far to fail her too. Inside by the fire, his voice was raw as torn paper. Rowan held his trembling hand as he spoke, haltingly, of that night. How he'd swapped places with his brother Thomas on the carriage bench, claiming he'd settle a debt in town. How the horses spooked on an icy pass. How the coach rolled. Thomas and his wife gone, Wren barely alive. He'd buried his name under the pines, certain the land would forgive what the blood could not. "I thought hiding made it right," he breathed, eyes fixed on the flicker of flame. "But every winter I hear the wheels. I see the road I should have taken." Rowan pressed his hand to her cheek, voice steady as the storm roared beyond the window. "You can't outlast regret, Calder. Maybe the bravest thing left is to stand in the open and let forgiveness find you." And somewhere in the dark, she felt the first crack in his silence. The town of Sable Creek gathered like crows on a fence when the bankmen rolled in. Word spread faster than the cold wind that carried it. Gray Mesa Ranch was about to be signed away, piece by piece, unless someone claimed what was left of the land and the bloodline that owned it. Rowan stood on the cracked steps of the old courthouse, Wren's small hand woven tight in hers. The girl's fingers trembled inside her wool mitten, but her eyes never left the door. Inside, the county men shuffled their papers, stamping red seals onto parchment that weighed more than any bullet. Outside, townsfolk whispered, "Is it true? Thought Calder Vance was dead. They say he rides with a wolf, watches from the ridge like a ghost." Rowan lifted her chin, feeling the stairs press against her like cold iron. Beside her, Wren whispered, almost to herself, "He's coming." She wanted to believe it, that Calder would step out from the pine shadows, not as the shade, but as a man who remembered how to stand in the daylight. But part of her wondered if she was asking too much. Some men bury themselves so deep that even love can't dig them up. Then the hush fell. So sudden it felt like the wind had stopped breathing. Rowan turned. Calder Vance stepped into the square, like he'd walked straight out of the legends they'd spun about him. He wore his old work coat, the collar mended, the brim of his hat shadowing the scar that marked him as both survivor and penitent. No wolf flanked him now, only the weight of every eye in Sable Creek. Rowan's chest ached watching him. She knew what this cost him. That the hardest thing for a man who'd lived so long in the trees wasn't crossing the ridge, but letting people see every wound he'd carried alone. A man near the front crossed himself. Another spat into the dirt as if to keep the ghost away. Calder ignored them all. He moved straight to the table where the bank agent stood waiting. Ledger cracked open like a fresh grave. "I'm Calder Vance," he said, voice raw but sure. "I stand as guardian to Wren Vance. This land is not for sale, not today." A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. But Rowan saw it then, that tiny shift in Wren's shoulders, the way the child leaned against her side like a sapling finding the sun. She squeezed Wren's hand, thinking of all the ways blood ties had failed this family. A brother lost, a niece left half-orphaned by secrets. But here they stood anyway, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Sometimes, she thought, blood will break you. But love you choose for yourself? That's what stitches you back together when nothing else will. And on that courthouse step, with the town whispering, "The shade walks among us again," Rowan knew they'd just begun to live again. Out loud, unhidden, ready to be seen. Spring came to Gray Mesa Ranch like a promise whispered through thawing pines. The land that once echoed only with the wind now carried the laughter of children running between the fence lines, boots muddy, hair wild and bright in the high sun. Rowan Ashford stood by the barn door one morning, hand resting on the rough wood, listening to their voices tumble through the rafters like birds come home to roost. Inside, the old parlor, once shuttered, heavy with shadows, had become the ranch's first schoolroom. Desks carved from spare planks sat in crooked rows, the scent of chalk dust mixed with the warmth of fresh biscuits cooling on the sill. Books that Calder carried down from the ridge now lined rough shelves, pages marked by curious fingers and ink smudges. Rowan moved among them all, teacher, caretaker, and something more than she ever dared believe she could be back in Boston's cold drawing rooms. Each lesson she wrote on the slate felt like a small defiance against the hush that had choked this land for so long. Outside, Calder Vance, no longer the shade but simply a man, worked alongside the ranch hands mending fence posts that had sagged under too many seasons of neglect. Now, when Rowan caught his silhouette at dusk, it was not perched high on the ridge, but striding toward home, the ghost replaced by steady footsteps that left prints for others to follow. In the kitchen, Wren sat at the wide pine table, brow furrowed over a page in her journal, the leather cover soft with wear, the edges of her letters still slightly crooked, but braver with every line. She dipped her pen, tongue poking at the corner of her mouth, and wrote, "When the wind wakes me before the sun, I hear birds singing like secrets only they know. I see the mountains smile, and I know the snow will come again, but we will not hide this time. The man they called a ghost sits by the fire now, his hands warm. He carved me a bird from pine, and it sits on my shelf to remind me. Some wings don't leave, they stay, like family does when they choose you back." When Wren closed the journal, her fingers traced the carved shape of the bird Calder had made for her. Rowan watched from the doorway, her eyes stinging at the simple miracle of it. That love could grow here again, in soil once salted with grief. Later, as dusk poured gold across Gray Mesa, Rowan stepped onto the porch. Children's voices drifted on the breeze, the scent of cedar smoke curling up to meet the first stars. Calder stood by the fence, hat tipped back, the lines on his face softer now. Not erased, but forgiven by the living he chose to do. Rowan's voice, quiet but sure, rose in her own mind like a prayer. In every quiet corner of these valleys, there's a story waiting to be rewritten, if only one broken soul is brave enough to come home. In the quiet hush of Gray Mesa, Calder Vance learned something many of us forget in the rush of modern life. Forgiveness doesn't always come all at once. It often arrives in small tokens, in hands reaching out across years of silence. Today, in our neighborhoods and families, we all carry some secret shame or old hurt buried deep like Calder did. And just like Rowan Ashford's steady kindness, it often takes just one person, one act of patience or courage, to help someone step back into the light. Maybe you see yourself in Wren too, waiting for someone you love to come back from the shadows. Or maybe you've been the ghost, watching from a distance, afraid you're too broken to be forgiven. What do you think? Do you believe people can truly change? Or do some ghosts stay ghosts forever? I'd love to hear what this story stirs up for you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has someone in your life ever come home to you, in their own way? If you found a piece of yourself in this tale, please tap that like button and subscribe for more stories that carry a bit of the old frontier's wisdom into today's world. From our campfire to yours, thank you for riding along with us tonight. And remember, sometimes the hardest road leads you exactly where you're meant to be.